Okay, so there's a heat warning in Canada right now, or not just Canada, but Toronto rather. So I can't go for my daily walk, so I figured, how am I going to kill this time for about an hour and a half that I would normally be spending while I'm out? So I decided I would just scroll through YouTube a little bit, and while I was scrolling through YouTube, I saw a fire tier list by Achimel DL for Dragalia Lost, which is a mobile game for people who are unfamiliar with this, because I've never made a DL video before. But one of the main problems I saw with Achimel DL's tier list is that he separated it in terms of the unit's viability in each mode. Like, for instance, he would have Leonidas in the Asura tier, even though Leonidas is good for not just Asura, he's good for Jaldabaoth and for Volk as well. So it can create this false sense of, oh, like, if you're watching the tier list and you see a character in this tier, that's the content you use them in, and then for the other content you can't really use them, or you should use other units, when that might not necessarily be the case. So I feel like just the format of that tier list wasn't as good as it could have been. I do actually think that it's a good time to do something like a fire adventure tier list, simply because we already have Volk, we have Jaldabaoth, and then we now have the Sinister Dominion fight that has fire as the secondary element. So fire is not going to get new content for a long time, so this is actually a great time to do this sort of content. But if you look at the tier list that I have in front of me, the tiers are... It's a bit confusing at first when you read it, but I can give you some like context examples. For instance, viable in all content, meta in all content. We'll start with that, and I'll use probably who everyone's expecting as the first example. Let me just go find our devilish first heir, Leonidas. Leonidas, if you see him in any fight, even the High Dragon fights, you see him in the High Dragon fights, you see him in Volk, you see him in Jaldabaoth, you see him in second phase Asura, and you're not going to complain about his inclusion at all. He's viable in all content, and he's meta in all that content. If you were trying to run a team of units to give you the best success rate and the most damage, you're usually going to consider Leonidas. So he's an example of someone who's good in all content and viable in all content. Then we'll go to the second tier, viable in all content. And by the way, I'm going to be, probably heavily editing this video, because there's going to be a lot of time where I'm like taking time to think, okay, well, this character, like this and this and this, like, are they good here? Are they bad there? So it's going to be very heavily edited. So I'm sorry if there's any sudden cuts. But that's for the second tier. Viable in all content, but meta in only some content. A really good example of a character like this would be Mim. Okay, so I was going to put Mim in the second tier, but after more deliberation, I realized she's actually more so in the third tier. And viable in all content, meta in one mode, or through niche setup. So Mim is a great example of a character who you can use in Sinister Dominion, but she's not really viable there because she doesn't get the strength off of her S1, she can't really benefit off of Dragon's Claws or Dragon's Skill, through Wormprint, so she becomes a lot weaker there. Maybe once she gets a Mana Spiral, maybe they'll make her S1 strength immune to Curse of Nihility, or maybe she'll get some strength amp and some extra mods, which will bump her up. I would certainly run with a Mim in Asura or in Jaldabaoth. I wouldn't really care that much, but she's certainly not meta there. If you were trying to craft like the ultimate team, you usually wouldn't consider Mim. She's good for some auto setups on Jaldabaoth if you have like Yuden in the lead with Mim backline to help get some Dragon Gauge, but that's really as far as it goes. In Volk, however, she's incredibly powerful. In fact, she's probably more viable in Volk than Leonidas is. You even see speedruns of like 4 Mims on Expert just killing him in like 40 seconds. It's really funny. Still a really good unit, still usable in all content, but you wouldn't consider her first for any of the Sinister Dominion content. So for those 2 boss fights. But for Volk, she's definitely, she's definitely the pick that you would go with in Volk. Now, I'm going to go back to the second one, because I was going to put Mim there, but then I realized that she's really only meta in Volk nowadays. Super meta in Volk, and certainly viable in all content, so go ahead and use her if you want to. But as for the second one, viable in all content, meta in some content. I'm going to go ahead and put Yuden here. Because Yuden certainly is viable in Asura and in Jaldabaoth. He kind of suffers the same problem that Mim does, though. He can't benefit off of Dragon Claws or Dragon Skill, and he's a dragon-centric character just in general. And not being able to get those bonuses through transformation in those fights can hurt him, but he is viable in that content because of the Dispel that he comes with. And he's able to drag in really often, especially if you have, let's say, like a Mim shared skill and a Humanoid Mercury shared skill. You can get Dragon Gauge incredibly quickly, especially if you have like a Leonidas backline. You're going to be building up Dragon very, very quickly. That being said, I think for Asura is where he's really not necessary, because Asura doesn't buff herself that much during her Phase 3 mask to really warrant running Yuden just because he can Dispel. I think you're probably better off running Naveed in that situation. But Yuden is really good in Jaldabaoth, because Jaldabaoth, he's constantly buffing himself, giving himself regen, giving himself defense, giving himself attack. Then there's mobs, especially in Master, and they all give themselves buffs. Void Agni and Void Nidhogg, they all have buffs, and it's just really annoying. So just being able to kind of auto-attack a whole slew of enemies and being able to dispel all of them is actually kind of nice. And Yuden is one of the best units. If you don't have Leonidas, he's the best unit to use in auto compositions for Expert Jaldabaoth, just because of his dragon form being able to come up so quickly. So I would say he's probably meta in Jaldabaoth, not as much in Asura, and definitely at meta in Volk. So that is how I determine a placing in that situation. Moving on to not viable in all content, meta in content that they are. A really good example of this would be someone like Grace. Grace is not viable in Sinister Dominion content, but she is meta in all content that she is, and that includes even off-element content. So someone like Grace would be basically the character to put in a tier like this, just to give a good example of that. But as for the actual character that's going to go in here, we are going to put Ezelit here. Ezelit is a character that is not viable in all content because you basically cannot use her in Sinister Dominion. You will do basically no damage. However, in the fights that she can go to, namely the High Dragon fights and the and Volk, I'm not really going to consider High Dragon fights in this sort of tier list just because of how dated they are. Any unit is viable in that content, and basically any unit can be meta there just because of how dated those fights are. So I'm not going to consider them. I'm only really considering Volk, Asura Phase 2, and Jaldabaoth. But Ezelit is a great example of a character who is only viable in Volk, and she's not viable at all in Sinister Dominion. But for Volk, she is another really strong meta character. Again, one of the speedruns is like, you run like triple Ezelit, plus it's like a Lowen with Gauna and Krenna or something crazy like that, right? And even without like certain niche setups, she is just really fantastic in Volk. And if you see Ezelit in your Volk room, there's really nothing to worry about there. Next, not viable in all content, meta in some content that they are. And then you have not viable in all content, not meta in content that they are. This is these are the parts of the list that I think are going to be the most empty, because most characters in this game are actually really good, and that's kind of the great thing about Dragalia Lost. But if I had to give you a good example of someone who fits into that green tier, not viable in all content and meta in some content that they are, we'd have to see. I think Zania. In fact, I actually think I might want to move Zania here. Do I want to move her here? I feel like just for the burn on Jaldabaoth, she can be useful. I've seen Zania's run in Jaldabaoth, but that doesn't make her meta. And she's not really. She used to be meta in Volk, so I think Zania is a good example of someone who goes here. Another good example of someone who goes down there is, where is my guy? Hunter Berserker. Hunter Berserker is another example of someone who goes here. I think I'm going to try ordering these. Within the tiers. I'll see how that goes. If I had to choose between the two of them, I think Zania would take priority over Berserker just because she's an enabler and Berserker is not. Berserker is another example of someone who is not viable in all kinds of content, but he is also not meta in any content that he could do, namely Volk. So that's another great example. So that's sort of how the tier list is going to be organized. I do kind of want to fill in this green one before I move on, because then you'll get like the full picture of like what I mean, because it's easier to understand how those tiers work when you have a character to compare it with. Okay, so I've decided to sort of like reamp or revamp, I guess, the green tier. I've added a caveat where not viable in all content, meta in some content that they are, or through a niche setup, similar to the tier that Mim is in. Mim's not there because of anything niche, but I wanted to have something similar there. So Martha's a good example of a character that's here that should be here because he's not viable in all of the content, because a lot of his buffs from his S2 don't work in Sinister Dominion. So he's really good for Volk, but he's not meta in Volk anymore unless you do those really cheesy speedrun strategies that you can do with Marth in Volk if you're trying to do a speedrun or like a really fast clear for grinding. And those are situations where he's really useful. So he can be meta in Volk, both for just him as a unit. He's still a good unit, plus that niche use of using his last... I forget what it's called, but that passive where like he takes damage and it refreshes everyone's cooldowns. So that's another situation where he's really useful in that niche scenario. So I want to continue on with the first tier and fill that out first. Viable in all content, meta in all content. So there's another character that undoubtedly needs to go here. And that character is a healer that we all know and love, Halloween Lowen. Halloween Lowen is basically the go-to. In fact, he is so good that he is used in the most popular expert Asura auto composition, despite the fact that he's not even a shadow unit for that, for the first half. That's how viable, that's how strong he actually is. And you basically want to see him in every content. He's good for all content. He's the best in slot. He provides more survivability for your team. He helps them not get one-shot because of the HP boost that he gives from his S2. Just a really good unit. Also, he's really good for auto compositions. There are some healers that are just really bad in auto comps, but Lowen is fantastic. So if you don't have Lowen, that's kind of unfortunate. But for the purposes of this tier list, he's absolutely viable in all content, meta in all content. So let's move on. I'm basically going to take most of these 4 stars and just put them down here at the end. I'm sure you could use some of these in some of the fights, but they're not meta in any fight. So they really should be here at the very bottom. Yeah, basically. So we're just going to go with this. Makoto. I kind of want to say that he also goes in the bottom tier. He can be really good in Volk, but not for the Sinister Dominion. So I almost feel like should I say he's meta for Volk though? I guess he's among the meta that you could use. You don't really see Makoto just because most people have Mim or Leonidas, so they just default to them. But if you didn't have Mim or Leonidas, you certainly could use Makoto or like Ezelit in Volk, because you're not going to use Makoto in Sinister Dominion. You're just not going to do that, especially because you can't use his Kindled Heart buff. So I would say that Makoto should go here, because I wouldn't call Marth meta for Volk anymore, whereas I think I could put Makoto and Ezelit as meta for Volk. So I still think Marth is a good example of someone who should go here. Another example of a character that would go here that's not in the fire element would be Mitsuba, because Mitsuba is not really like she's not viable for all the content, but through niche setup she's amazing for certain speedruns. But she's probably decently meta for the twins, so this would be a good example here because of like niche setups as well. But we're gonna move on to the next flame character. Melsa. I don't really see Melsa anywhere, and she's not meta, so I'm just gonna put her here. Cerise. Cerise might have to go down here. It's unfortunate because she's a Gala character, and it really doesn't feel like a Gala character should be this weak. But she's based on buff, so you can't use her in Sinister Dominion. But even in Volk, she's not meta, so she has to be down here. 100 Berserker, And Zania, I would much prefer seeing over somebody like Cerise if I'm in a Volk room. So yeah, she's gonna go after them. Moving on. Valentine's Ezelit used to be one of the most meta characters back when Burning Punisher was introduced because she was one of the few characters that actually could burn reliably. So I think just because of that history, I'm going to put her here. Aoi is also decently strong. I'm going to try and order these. But there comes a point where it just doesn't matter. Like here and onward, it really just doesn't matter. I can put Melsa here, though. Okay, let's move on. Editing this video is going to be weird if I even decide to upload it. Marty, I love you, but you're trash. You're trash. So Noah... No. Her shared skill is really nice. Or it can be nice. Depends on if you get lucky. Let's see. Oh yeah, I guess I'll just go to the bottom. And put Summer Alex. I kind of want to put her here next to Yuden. Because I wouldn't say that she's meta in Volk. She is meta in both of the Sinister Dominion fights for Fire because she provides strength amp for her team, and she has a strength amp limit of 3, so she's really good to enable a level 3 team strength amp if you don't actually have one on your team. She does some decent damage, and for both Asura, being able to reduce his Scorch Rend resistance, or her Scorch Rend resistance, is really useful. I don't really keep that in mind. I feel like kind of what's happened is the community was like, oh, okay, well, if Asura has such ridiculous affliction resistances, we're just not going to run affliction punishers. We're just going to go in raw, which is what most people do, so that they don't have to worry about switching their Wormprints back and forth every time an Alex joins the room so that they can run Scorch Rend. But if you are planning a team, let's say for solo, or you have a group of friends for co-op and you're planning your composition together, Alex is probably a must-have for Asura just because of how good Scorch Rend Punisher is. Strength Amp is really good, and she does some decent damage. For Jal Beoth, obviously she's going to be really useful there because she doesn't suffer from the Curse of Nihility like a lot of the other characters do. But for Volk, I don't really find a character like Summer Alex necessary, simply because there's really no issue with Scorch Rend in that fight at all. And there's so many other better units that you could be running in Volk, like Ezelit or Makoto, that just do way more damage than her, and don't really need her increased Scorch Rend affliction rate when you have someone like Leonidas in the room. Like, I've run Volk and even Jal Beoth, where it'll be like 3 Leonidases constantly applying Scorch Rend, and the boss never becomes resistant to it. It rarely happens. Because Jal Beoth and Volk have naturally lower resistances to Scorch Rend. So in Volk, I wouldn't say that she is a meta option, but she certainly is viable there. I wouldn't complain if I saw a Summer Alex in my room, but I wouldn't say that she's meta. So I think this is a good tier for her to go into. Moving on. Okay, so I'm actually going to put Ferrous in the same tier as Mim. Viable in all content, meta in one mode or through niche setup. And the reason I'm putting Ferrous here is because, like, even though you don't really see Ferrous that much, it's really just because a lot of other units are better, or people have had them for a long time, so they're already built, so they don't really bother. But Ferrous is really good in the Asura fight phase 2, because by the time you get to the phase 2, Ferrous will have his sigil automatically unlocked. That's just something that all of the sigil characters have as like a little gimmick. And that is very useful because once he gets his sigil unlocked, Ferrous can actually be really good. So even though you don't really see him, I would judge him just based on how strong I know he can be. And I would say that he would be meta for Asura in that circumstance. Now, just because you don't see him, that doesn't mean that he wouldn't be a strong meta pick if he were more popular to use. But that is a really niche situation. And besides that, you don't really want to see him that much in Jal Beoth. And you don't really want to see him in Volk that much either. I mean, he's a good enabler, but there are much better options in Volk and Jal Beoth than to use Ferrous. But in the second half of the Master Asura fight, he's very good. Okay, so Gala Laxi. I think I'm going to put Gala Laxi in the highest tier. Unfortunately, she can't really benefit off of the afflictions that she can apply even after her spiral in the second half of the Asura fight. But that doesn't mean that she's not amazing and that she doesn't do incredible amounts of damage. She's still really good if you see a Laxi in your room, especially if she's 70 MC and she's a strength amp enabler and she gets bonus percentages on her mods. I certainly wouldn't complain if I saw Laxi in any of my rooms, and I would say that she's probably meta for all of the content. Like, she would definitely be someone that you would consider for all of the fights. So I think that this is a good place for her to go. Elisan. I would say Elisan probably goes into this tier next to her lesbian lover Alex. Mostly just because you wouldn't really use Elisan in Asura, I don't think, just because of the Scorch Rend stuff, unless you have an Alex as an ally. So that would be a niche situation, where you actually would be okay with using her. But she is really good. Well, should she go here? Because she's really good in Gel Beoth, but I wouldn't say she's meta for Volk. She's viable in Volk, but I wouldn't call her a meta pick. Especially because of how fast you can kind of tear him down before her buffs even come into effect. I think she actually might be better off here. Because Alex is good for both Asura and Gel Beoth, whereas she's good for Gel Beoth, not as amazing in Asura, and not as meta in Volk, but you certainly wouldn't mind seeing her in any of those fights, but she wouldn't be my first choice. Whereas if I had Summer Alex, unfortunately I do not have Summer Alex, but if I had her and I was making a composition to do solo Gel Beoth or solo Asura on Master, and I was making my fire team, I would absolutely consider putting her on the team just because of that Scorch Rend stuff, right? So I think that that's where that difference lies. So I think that this is a good spot for Elisan as well. Meta in one mode, mostly being Gel Beoth, but viable in the rest. Moving on. Yachiyo. You don't really see Yachiyo that much, but I would say that she this one will actually go here, because since she was built in mind, with Curse of Nihility, she's not really affected by it at all, which makes her instantly a meta candidate, especially because she is, in the fire element, she's one of the higher DPS characters that you can get in the fire element, especially when you consider Curse of Nihility. She's like top 3 or top 5, so just damage-wise, you're going to want her on either an Asura team or a Gel Beoth team. You can absolutely use her in Volk, but once again, I don't think she would be meta in Volk. I think if you wanted to make like a really super meta team, it would be a lot of Mims, a lot of Leonidases, maybe a burn enabler, and then like a healer, and then you're off to the races, right? If you're doing Legend. So I think that this is a good spot for Yachiyo. Very good unit. I do like her gimmick. I do like characters that are centric around 4 strikes. They tend to be some of the most fun that you can play. I love rapid fire Manicasters. I love Lapis. I love Xena. I love Ilya. I just love 4 strike gimmick characters. I think that they're some of the most fun characters that you can play. Just because like you put all of it into this one shot, and then you let it loose, and it's just so fun to watch. So let's see. We're going to do Child Ranzel here. I'm going to go to the bottom here. Child Ranzel. It's kind of weird with Child Ranzel, because I don't really consider him to be meta in any of the content, but he's certainly viable in all of the content. So it's kind of weird, because I don't really have a spot like that, where they are viable in all content, but you wouldn't want to use them. But I do think he'd probably fit in a mode, like, I think I'd have to put him here then, at the bottom. Even though he's not meta in any of the modes. I mean, I guess you could say that he'd be meta in, like, Gel Beoth, but you don't really see him. So this is kind of a weird one. But I'm going to put him here just because he fits the criteria of being viable in all content. And then we'll just say that he could be a meta option for Gel Beoth. I don't think you'd want to use him for Asura as much. Just because he doesn't really have like large hitboxes or anything like that. But for Gel Beoth, I think he'd be a good option. So Child Ranzel can go there. Although I think that this is actually quite generous. He lucked out because of the criteria of my list. But I still think that this is probably the best way to do it if you want to make the distinction between how good characters are and how viable they are across modes. Rather than just kind of making it like an S to a C tier or just sorting them by the modes themselves. I think this is a better way to do it, even though there's going to be some inconsistencies like with Ranzel here. At the same time, like maybe Ranzel is better than I'm giving him credit for. I don't usually see him. But maybe if I saw him more in action, I would change my mind. So, we're going to move on. We're going to grab Panther here. Panther. Well, she's certainly viable in all content. She's not really affected by Curse and Nihility very much at all. And even in Volk, she can be really good. I don't really think that she would be meta in Volk. Certainly usable there. But she certainly would be meta in both Asura and Jaldabaoth. I've seen her in both content. She works really well, especially with the right print setup and the right dragon. So I'm going to go ahead and put her here. Especially if you have like Agni on her, she's actually very strong. Plus she's a Scorching Enabler, plus she has Dispel. Also, since she has her own gauge, she works really well as an AI ally just because she can transform without having to be the lead unit. She does have this weird habit of force striking a lot as an auto unit, so you know, take that with a grain of salt. But especially controlled by the player, she's good in both of the Sinister Dominion content that you could take her to. Large hitboxes as well, like on her S1, to really take advantage of hitting AoEs to get more orbs. Very good unit actually. Moving on down, Seimei. I really like Seimei. I think Seimei is a really cool unit. You could use him in all the content, so he'd probably go here. And here's the thing, like he is viable in all the content, so I think I'm gonna put him here next to Ranzel. I wouldn't really consider him meta for any of the content, but he does fulfill some meta needs, like being able to dispel. He's certainly got some really good damage on him, so I think this is another character where it's like for Jaldabaoth, I think he'd be really good. Actually, I think for Jaldabaoth, Seimei could be considered a meta option. Obviously not as meta as somebody like Leonidas, but just being able to dispel puts him here. And then he's good for all the content, so I think Seimei, this is a good spot for him to be in. And like I said, I am trying to order this out, so I think this is a good way to do it. I'm actually going to put Ranzel behind him. Let's look for another fire character. We got here Nefaria. Nefaria is an interesting character. She's not. I don't even know if she'd be viable for Volk, to be honest. You could probably use her in Volk, but she's just really slow. In scenarios where you don't want her to be that slow, Volk's always dashing around all over the place. So I don't even think I would call her viable for Volk, and certainly not meta. But she does have a niche use case in Jaldabaoth, just because she drops this big-ass meteor and it basically hits the entire arena. So she's really good for killing ads in Jaldabaoth, and that alone makes her at least a niche option in that mode. So I'm going to, and then for Asura, she's fine, but she's not meta. So I think I'm going to put her here next to Marth, because she's not viable in all the content. I don't think I would call her viable in Volk. But I think that she could be considered a niche or meta option for Jaldabaoth specifically, just because of that nice use case of being able to sweep the mobs. And Jaldabaoth is not someone that you have to rush down. He's not jumping all over the place. And even while charging a Force Strike, a lot of his attacks are easier to dodge. Except for like those green, like swirly tornado things he sends out. But usually whoever gets marked will bait them the other way. So that's not usually something you have to worry about. And he doesn't do that all the time. So I think that this would be a good spot for Nefaria to go through. higher than Marth. It's kind of crazy to see how far Marth has fallen off. We're going to go to Mim here, Halloween Mim. Very sexy. Not very good. Well, she is viable, but she's not meta anywhere. In all content, not meta in any content. So I'm just gonna put that in there, and then I think Mim can go here, and Ranzel can go here. I think Seimei, I would still consider him to be meta for at least Jaldabaoth, but I think Mim and Ranzel, I think this is a good spot for them to go into, because I wouldn't be mad seeing them in any of those modes, either Volk or the two Sinister Dominion fights, but they're certainly not meta at all. Where at least Seimei, for Jaldabaoth, I can consider a meta option just because of the utility he provides, and Dispel is very important in that fight. Plus there's the damage, right? Whereas these two, much lower on the damage scale. So let's move on. We're going to go to Cassandra. Cassandra is an interesting case because she does come with overdamage, which is very, very useful. The problem is that if you have Cassandra, then you don't need Cassandra because you can just take her shared skill and just give it to a better healer like Lowen. Because Lowen is just a better healer in general than Cassandra, and he would have access to overdamage just as much as somebody like Cassandra would. So I wouldn't say that she's unviable. She's certainly good, and she can certainly keep your party alive, but I think Lowen is just better overall. But you could certainly use her in any of the content. She's just not meta because of how overshadowed she is by Lowen. And if you have her, you may as well just get her shared skill and slap it on Lowen instead. But if you don't have Lowen, then there's no harm in running Cassandra herself in any of the content. As long as you keep people alive, no one is going to complain. So I think that's a really good spot to put her in. I'm glad I made that tier. Emma. I think for Emma, I'm going to put her in this tier. Wait, no, not that tier. Sorry. I think here. Okay, I'm going to put Emma here. Emma is really nice here just because she's a buff bot, and she also has a defense buff on her S2. So what you could do is in Volk, especially in Legend Volk, you could run a double buff composition with Emma here and you know, call that a day. So you could run like her buffs, plus you're getting double buff, plus you'd have some shared skills like Lowen shared skill and Padia, and you'd have a really strong double buff composition character. So I think in that situation, she could actually be considered a meta option for Volk, just because of how much more damage your team would be doing under that circumstance. But if you're not taking double buff shenanigans into account, I don't think that she would even be considered meta in a fight like Volk. I think you would just prefer to take enablers and then just go crazy with DPS. So I'm going to put her here just for that niche double buff option, you know, if you decide to go for that. Crom. I love playing Crom. He's not amazing though. Crom is unfortunately just not good. He is viable for Volk. You could use him in Volk, but he's certainly not meta in that fight. He's just a little bit too slow to ramp up. And he just doesn't compare to anybody else. But you could use him in Volk. That being said, though, it's just he doesn't really have it. He's fun to play though, especially if you want to do like standard or expert Volk on like co-op or something. Crom is a great unit to take there because as soon as you get the break, it's basically over. So he's really fun to play, but he's not really meta, and he's only really good in Volk because Sinister Dominion kills his Aether mechanics, which is very unfortunate for him. We're gonna move on. Yue. Only thing good about Yue is her shared skill, which gives her the crit rate and the attack increase, but decreases her defense. Really useful in certain situations. I've used her shared skill a lot with Albert in Tartarus. Really useful, especially if your team is running a Xena and Xena's heal isn't up, but you need to heal. Her shared skill is really useful for that. Plus the crit rate is fantastic on somebody like Albert. And Wild Instinct isn't mitigated by Curse of Nihility. So her shared skill will actually work in that content. Yue herself, though, I wouldn't really say that she is viable in most content, and she's certainly not meta in any of it, so I think that she should go here. I'm definitely going to put her after Verica, just because of that shared skill and how useful that it can be. So I think that's a good place for her to be. Reina, I actually don't know where Reina stands, because she used to be meta in High Dragons, and then she used to be meta in Volk, and then more 70 MCs came out, and then she was no longer meta in Volk. And then she got buffed with 2.0, and then and now they've made her skill shift ignore Curse and Agility, so she can actually use her Blazing Furnace skill shifts on her S1, which is actually very nice, but her S2 is still negated. I don't know how much that skill shift affects her viability, and I certainly don't see her in any rooms. So I'm going to put her here for now, but I'm certainly open to the idea that she could at least be meta in Jaldabaoth. If she were to get a Mana Spiral, that'd be really cool. I like Reina a lot. I was really happy when I got Reina. She's very pretty, and she's fun to play. She's the character that I used, in fact, to get my first clears on the High Dragon Trials when they first came out. Those were some fun times. But Reina's a character I use, so I have a lot of fondness for her, but I don't really see her around anymore, and I have no idea if her skill shift, being allowed to work, will even affect her viability in Sinister Dominion content. If it does, and you're watching this video after Reina's kind of already proven herself, then you can go ahead and mentally put her like up here, to say that, oh, she's meta in Asura now because she can use skill shift, or she's meta in Jaldabaoth for the same reason, right? You can retroactively correct me in the future if you want, but for now I think that she should be here. On to the next one, Naveed. Naveed is an interesting character because for the longest time I didn't use Naveed, and then Jaldabaoth came out and I was in a pickle because unless you're playing healer, most of the time it was like Leonidas or bust, right? I think now it's opened up a little bit more. People are a little bit less strict about it. But I still to this day do not have Leonidas, so Naveed is the guy that I use for all of my Jaldabaoth runs. In fact, Naveed is also the guy I used for my Master Asura run as well. I don't know if I would say that he's meta in any fight like Volk. I think he would be okay in Legend, just because that fight's a little bit longer, so he has more time to stack up. But in something like Standard, Legend, or even Master, he can take a long time to stack up, whereas other characters would be doing way more damage. And surpassing certain HP checks in Volk is really useful for skipping certain problematic attacks that can be a room wipe, like the tornadoes, like the 4 tornadoes in Master. So being able to skip something like that is indispensable. So I wouldn't say that he is meta in Volk, but I would say that he is meta in the Sinister Dominion fight. So I'm going to put him up here. I'm even going to put him over here. Naveed does some disgusting damage. Having Dispel, really useful for Jaldabaoth. And of course, being really tanky is really nice. You can just brush off attacks like they're nothing. And like I said, the damage he can do is disgusting. He doesn't have the most range in the world, but this could easily be offset depending on the shared skill you're running. You can run a Eugene shared skill, you can run a Eugene shared skill, or my new favorite character, Mascula. Mascula's shared skill is absolutely broken, so if you have Mascula, there's really nothing to worry about in terms of range for something like Asura. But even, not accounting for that, I still think that he is a meta fire character for Sinister Dominion content, so that's why I'm putting him here. I don't think he shines quite as much in Volk as Laxi or Leonidas or even Mim, so I'm inclined to keep him here instead of putting him up here. But he is very close to this level of power. Naveed certainly surprised me when Jaldabaoth came out. Lee! Dead on arrival. God damn. I'm putting you after Melsa even. You're going after Joe. You trash. Someone on Reddit brought up a really good point about how counter skills need to be buffed because the multiplier on the reflect damage for characters like Leah and Cassandra are based off of the HP lost and not like taking the HP loss and then multiplying it by like your strength. It's just an additive damage based on the HP lost. So since it's additive and not multiplicative, reflect damage characters have fallen off quite a bit. The only exception to this rule is Fjorm, who's just so strong that she's still really good to use. But Lee, even when she came out, just really was not good at all. It's very unfortunate because people were excited for her because of the Worm print where she was featured and that she came out and she was a 5-star and everyone was like, oh shit, and then she sucked. You know, so what are you gonna do? Hildegard, Valentine's Hildegard. I would say that she's viable in all content. Certainly not meta in any content, especially because you have Lowen there. Actually, that might not be true. I think if you're going to run a healer in Volk, I think that Hildegard would actually be the better option. Because Volk is not such a challenging fight that you need the healing that Lowen can do. So if you had the option to choose between Hildegard and Lowen for something like Volk, I would actually say that you should use Hildegard, just because she can energize her team with her abilities and provide them some extra damage, which makes her a slightly better option for him. But obviously he's still meta even in Volk. But I think that just because of that niche energize that she can bring to her team, that makes her a meta pick, at least for Volk, as far as healers are concerned. So, 0.1 for Hildegard, I guess. Ramona. Again, brings me back to the days of Ramona, Emma, Reina, and Verica in Master High Midgard Stormer, back when that fight came out. One of the viable units back then, and I remember even when Volk first came out, most of the lobbies looked the same. Most of the lobbies were like Ramona and Reina and Emma because that's what we were used to. And we kind of had to adjust to using Ezelit and Uden back when those Mana Spirals came out. So that was a really fun time. Now, Ramona, she just unfortunately just suffered the fate of being kind of power crept. I think that Reina still stands above her though. So I'm going to put Ramona around here. A decent unit, does some decent damage, but from a utility perspective, she doesn't really provide a lot. And in the damage department, she just doesn't compete as much anymore with some of the other characters that come out. So I feel like this is a good place for her to be. Moving on to the next fire character. Laxi. I don't really understand Laxi, right? Because I never see her, and when I use her, she feels bad. But in the DPS simulator, it always shows her like with crazy ass damage, so I don't understand that. But I think that she would probably be viable in all content, but she's certainly not meta in all content. So I'm going to leave Laxi here, because I know that she can do good damage even in the Sinister Dominion. So you can probably use her in all the content, but you probably wouldn't want to see her. Moving on. I almost said Konohana Sake. This is Kozunohana. Or is it Kazunohana? Kozunohana or Kazunohana? Whatever. Nohana. Not an amazing healer. Certainly not meta. Cassandra has her beat just because of that. Just because of her shared skill. But Kozunohana or is it Kozunohana? What the fuck? What is her name? Whatever. I don't care. She does have access to overdamage, so you probably could use her. But she's not really meta. So I feel like I should probably put her here. Because I feel like you could probably use her in all the content if you wanted to, but she's not really meta. But she is a healer and she does provide overdamage, and I feel like that's enough to make her viable. So I'm going to leave her here. It's a shame that her share skill wasn't like they didn't allow you to share skill her heal, because I guess they didn't want to give people access to a free overdamage shared skill. They were smart. They knew what they were doing. So we're going to move on to Student Maribel. Student Maribel is going to go here. Because she's not meta in Volk, but she certainly is meta for Sinister Dominion content. When you account for every other character, or most other characters getting pretty heavily nerfed because of Sinister Dominion limiting their buffs, Maribel comes in not being affected by that at all, and still being a really strong nuke with defense downs. So she's really good there. So in both of the Sinister Dominion fights, Maribel is definitely a meta option. For Volk, I don't think she's as popular. I think that you would want to diversify the characters you're using to try and accommodate more afflictions. Like I was saying before, like if you're going to run any character in your team for Volk that doesn't apply an affliction themselves, it'd probably be Mim, just because of how much stronger Mim is than everybody else in the fire element in non-nihility content. But you'd probably want a Scorch Rend and a Burn Enabler, and then last slot healer. So it's hard to squeeze Maribel in on a fight like that. And even if you had the room, even if you weren't running Mim for instance, you'd probably want to run something like Ezelit or Makoto instead. I think that they would be better options. So I think Maribel works here just because of how good she is in Sinister Dominion content. Moving on. Yuya. I don't really think he's viable in any content. I don't really think that he is viable in all content. I know that he can do some damage. I've seen some surprising results for him on the DPS simulator, but I really don't consider him to be that viable. And he's certainly not viable in Sinister Dominion content because you can't really use his Rowdy Rumbler skill because of that. So I'm gonna put him here. Or at the very least, maybe I'll put him here, but no, I'll put him here. I think that's where he should be. I'm sorry to fans of the character, but he's not amazing. Nobunaga. I'm gonna say here. I don't really like Nobunaga that much. I don't think she really does that much damage. And even for dispelling, there are other units that are better, like Yuden and Naveed. But she's not awful. She does do some decent damage. And she can dispel on a whim as long as her combo count is at a certain level, which is really useful for something like Jal de Bayoff. If your team messes up and somehow he gets like a 4-stack of buffs, she can just go and all of his buffs are gone. And no other character can really do that. So I think for Jal de Bayoff, she could be considered a meta option. But certainly not one you'd prefer. But she is viable in all content, for sure. So I think this is a good place for her to be. And I would probably put her above Hildegard, obviously. Is that all the fire characters? There has to be more fire characters. Am I just like... Oh, it's Juan Zhang. It's Juan Zhang, you ass. You're going over here. Chelsea. Chelsea can do some crazy damage. Especially with that new worm print. So I don't know how good she actually is now. Especially because of the new Albert 2-star worm print from Asura. So I can definitely see there being niche scenarios where she's really good in Volk, but she can't really succeed in the other fights just because of creeping corrosion. You're going to want a healer constantly healing people. Even if you're not running a healer in Expert Asura, because I've actually done some healerless clears, you're still going to want a healing shared skill, which will end up ruining Chelsea a little bit. So I'm going to put her here in, like, there are probably some scenarios where in niche situations, she can be really strong, really powerful. But besides that, I don't think that she's really that amazing. Which is a shame because I like Chelsea a lot. Mega Man! He's not really amazing, which is a shame. Mega Man, both his event and his character in the game is very muted in general. And I didn't mean for that to be a pun because he doesn't talk. But he's kind of one of those characters that was dead on arrival. He was interesting, but didn't really shake anything up. I think the problem is, like, he's a little bit too specific in his playstyle to really be useful. And he doesn't even do that much damage. He was like a bleed-centric character because of his metal blades. It's just a weird niche situation. So I'm going to say he probably deserves to be at the bottom. Because I don't really consider him to be viable, really. So I'll put him here. I think this is a good spot for him to be. Okay, yeah. So I just had a second look through. And there are actually no more fire characters left to judge. So this is how I'm going to leave it off. At the top tiers, characters that are viable and meta in all content, you have Leonidas, Lowen, and Laxi. Then viable in all content, meta in some, you have Naveed, Yuden, Summer Alex, Armored Yachiyo, Panther, and Maribel. Viable in all content, meta in one mode or through your niche setup, you have Mim, Ferrous, Kimoto, Elisan, Seimei, Nobunaga, and Hildegard. Viable in all content, but not meta in any content, you'd have Child Ranzel, Halloween Mim, Yukata Cassandra, Laxi, and Kozunoha, or Kozunohana, I forget. I think it's Kozunoha, whatever. Not viable in all content, meta in all content that they are, basically meaning that they're meta in Volk, but they're not usable in the other content. You have Ezelit and Makoto. Not viable in all content, meta in some content that are, or through niche situations. You have Incognito Nefaria, Marth, Emma, and Chelsea, and then the rest would be in not viable in all content and not meta in content that they are viable. So for instance, like a Hunter Berserker, you can use him in Volk. He's certainly viable in Volk, but he's not meta there. And a lot of the other characters fall into that category, and then you wouldn't even want to use them in Sinister Dominion. So I think that this is a really good list for determining a character's overall strength, and if you have the greater context of me explaining in which situations they're most useful, you can even make more accurate determinations about their strength. I do look forward to making lists like this for other Dragalia Lost characters. This has been a lot of fun. Maybe when another element gets their second half in Sinister Dominion, I will do that element's tier list at the time that happens. But I was mostly motivated to do this because I saw Achimel DL's tier list, so I kind of wanted to do one of my own and also, reimagine the tiers and their categories, just because I thought that his scope was a little bit limited. So this is how I'm going to do it. So let me know what your thoughts are down below if you think I'm crazy. And I'll link Achimel DL's tier list down below. And by the way, if you're a subscriber of mine and you usually watch my Smash content and you have no idea what the fuck any of this is, this is all for a mobile game called Dragalia Lost. I highly recommend it. It's a really good game. Check it out. You probably see me tweeting about it all the time. But that's going to be it for the tier list, and have a nice day.